In 1966, Cornell University launched a new accelerated PhD program with the assistance of a $2.1 million grant from the Ford Foundation. The program would allow incoming freshmen to complete their doctorate degree in just 6 years. Generally speaking, a student would need at least 4 years of graduate study after their 4 years of undergraduate education in order to obtain their PhD by following the typical path of study. Cornell was a member of the Ivy League and one of the most prestigious schools in the United States. It provided an excellent education, and many of the top students from around the world vied for admission to the school. However, the accelerated PhD program was viewed as an opportunity to set Cornell apart from other top schools in the country and lure the very best of the best students away from institutions like Harvard and Yale, as it would provide them the opportunity to advance in academia at an accelerated rate. The program aimed to produce the highest quality of scholars in the shortest amount of time possible by reducing undergraduate and graduate curriculums. The program utilized a curriculum that was rigorous even by Ivy League standards and advanced placement courses in order to try to provide the same exceptional level of education in a seemingly impossibly short amount of time. It would also provide a $3,000 a year stipend during the years of graduate study, so that students in the program would not need to work as research assistants or teach undergraduate courses, as many graduate students do, allowing them more time to focus on their own studies. The program would be the first of its kind in the United States. The first cohort of students in the program arrived at the school's campus in Ithaca, New York, in the fall of 1966. Nearly half of the 48 students had been the valedictorian or salutatorian of their graduating high school class, and their median scores on both sections of the SAT were more than 75 points higher than the median scores of the students in Cornell's regular freshman class. There were, of course, concerns from Cornell faculty members about the program being elitist, as well as about the feasibility of students being able to handle the pressure of the accelerated program. Another controversy arose over the living situation provided for the program students. All of the students, 35 men and 13 women, would be housed together in Cornell's first co-ed dorm, the Cornell Heights Residential Club. In addition to the fact that male and female students would be living together for the first time at the school, there were concerns that the living situation would isolate the members of the program from the rest of the Cornell community. Dean Stephen Parrish, the director of the program, argued that the program having a dedicated residential center was part of what drew students to the program. The Res Club, as it would come to be known, was located on Country Club Road. It had originally been built as a motel in 1953 and was located just to the north of the Cornell campus. The university purchased it in 1964 and began using it for student housing in 1966, when the first group of students in the accelerated program arrived at Cornell. In addition to the FUDs, as the accelerated PhD students came to call themselves, the Res Club also housed approximately 24 female students, mainly graduate students and undergraduate seniors, on its second floor. A cook, 3 faculty members, and a student counselor also resided there, bringing its total occupancy to 71 people. The demanding nature of the advanced PhD program often cost its members sleep, a circumstance which proved fortuitous on April 5, 1967. At 4 a.m. that morning, Diego Benedetti was still awake, having stayed up all night struggling with a paper for a government class in his room in the Res Club. He heard something outside his room, and when he opened his door, he found that the hallway was filling with thick smoke. He began screaming fire and running down the hallway, knocking on doors to alert his fellow students. He pulled a fire alarm as he made his exit from the building, but nothing happened when he did. Without the fire alarm, the residents of the building were mainly awoken and made aware of the fire thanks to the screams of warning from other students and the noise they made as they escaped the building. As thick, toxic smoke spread through the Res Club, many students could not travel through the hallways or reach an exit. Instead, they had to leave the building through its windows. The Res Club had 2 main floors and a basement level. However, because the building was constructed on slanted ground, rooms on the backside of one of the building's main wings were higher off of the ground than their locations would suggest. First-floor rooms on that side of the building were a story above the ground, with the windows from the basement level at ground level. Students shoved rags and clothes against the cracks under the doors to their rooms in an attempt to hold off the smoke seeping into their room as they tried to escape through their windows. Some of the residents on higher floors jumped from their windows, and others knotted together sheets so they could climb down. Students who had escaped the building ran to a nearby fraternity house for help and located ladders to help evacuate residents of the second floor. A fraternity member arriving with the fraternity house's ladder was directed to the kitchen, where the res club's cook, who was in her mid-60s, was leaning out of the window of her quarters above it. The fraternity member climbed the ladder, threw the cook over his shoulder, and carried her to safety. Fire trucks quickly arrived on the scene, and more students were evacuated using their ladders. Tragically, not everyone escaped the fire. Help had arrived so quickly because of a phone call made at 4:08 a.m. by John Albin Finch, Ph.D. Professor Finch was a former infantry officer in the British Army who was, in 1967, an assistant professor of English at Cornell and the faculty resident in charge at the Res Club. After he placed the call for help, he was able to easily exit the building through its main entrance, due to the location of his room on the first floor. However, after making his successful escape from the building, Professor Finch ran back inside to alert students of the danger. He banged on furniture to awaken residents and get their attention, and screamed for them to run. At least 4 of the fire's 62 survivors have attributed their survival directly to Professor Finch's actions. Professor Finch did not exit the building a second time. He succumbed to the smoke in the Res Club's foyer. His body was found near the bodies of 2 students, less than 15 feet away from the building's main door. Professor Finch was 37 years old. He was later remembered as a man of wide-ranging knowledge, with a lucid and flexible intelligence, a ready wit, and a quietly distinctive grace in demeanor and speech. The Finch family would continue to show dedication to the students living in the Res Club even after Professor Finch's death. His sister, Veronica Finch, traveled to Ithaca from Nigeria after being notified of her brother's death, and extended her time there by 2 days in order to continue comforting the students who had survived the fire. In addition to Professor Finch, 8 students were killed, 3 of them Fuds. Martha Beck was studying to be a scientist and would have become an inspiration and a role model to generations of women in science, according to one of her classmates. Jeffrey Smith had been just 17 years old at the time of his death, shy in social situations, but brilliant at math. Peter Couch would later be described as being good at anything and everything, and someone who was instantly liked by those he met. The other 5 students killed were residents of the second floor, who were not a part of the accelerated PhD program. Jenny Zhuwei Sun, 21, was a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences studying math, who had plans to work with computers after she graduated. Mei Mei Cheng, 22, was a graduate nutritional sciences student who had studied German as well as 4 dialects of Chinese. 21-year-old Anne McCormick was a senior studying home economics. She stood only 4 feet 10 inches tall, but had a dynamic personality and was full of energy, which she often used to help her friends. Carol Kurtz, 22, was a serious and dedicated nutrition graduate student. 25-year-old graduate student Johanna Christina Walden had come to Cornell from Finland to study agriculture. One of the other Res Club residents had found a ladder during the evacuation and had initially taken it to Johanna's window so she could escape down it. However, there was a visibly distressed resident leaning out her window a few rooms down, and Johanna asked him to take the ladder to assist the more frantic resident first. Pete Seeger had been scheduled to perform on Cornell's campus on April 5th, and he took time during his performance to speak about each of the people who had died in the fire earlier that day. 2 days later, a memorial service was held at Cornell's Sage Memorial Chapel. 1,200 people attended the service in person, with the overflow crowd of several hundred more people listening to the service through speakers on the student union. All 9 people who perished in the fire died of asphyxiation. The fire had started in the basement lounge of the Res Club. 2 couches, both made of naugahyde, quickly caught fire. Naugahyde is an American-made type of artificial leather with a PVC coating, which creates a thick, oily, and toxic black smoke when it is burned. Firefighters and other first responders to the scene reported feeling weak and dizzy after exposure to the residual fumes. The fire had then spread to wood paneling in the basement corridor, which carried it to the basement bedrooms and to a stairwell outside of the lounge. The Res Club was considered to be fire-resistive because of its brick exterior and the precast concrete used in its construction. In one sense, this is accurate, as the building itself still stands to this day, now known as the Ecology House, and went back into use at the beginning of the fall 1967 semester, after interior repairs. However, the building was full of fire code violations, which allowed the toxic smoke to spread throughout the building, and prevented residents from escaping the building. The alarm system did not work, and there were no fire escapes or sprinklers in the building. Fire doors that adhere to modern standards did not exist at the time, but there had been what were considered to be adequate fire doors in the building. However, the fire doors leading to a staircase in the basement had been propped open, and 2 fire doors on the second floor had been taken down because they no longer fit over new carpet that had been installed. These doors, had they all been up and closed, could have helped slow the spread of the smoke. Cornell had begun the process of installing a partial sprinkler system in the building the month before the fire, but a strike at the factory of the manufacturer of the parts necessary to complete the work had caused the installation to be delayed. The parts were eventually delivered, and work on the sprinklers was scheduled to begin on April 5th, mere hours after the fire began. Robert Gaudet, an investigator with the National Fire Protection Association, who was on the scene of the fire within days of it occurring, stated that all evidence indicates that fully sprinklered buildings and detection systems have prevented loss of life and injury, but this building didn't have it. A state official and the National Fire Protection Association further found that the inadequate and substandard means of escape from the building also contributed to the deaths that resulted from the fire. In direct violation of New York state law, Cornell did not file a 1966 fire inspection report on the Res Club. Furthermore, the university did not hold any kind of fire drills in the building. In June of 1967, 2 months after the fire, Cornell's Board of Trustees allocated $750,000 for what it described as an accelerated life safety program to rectify some of the safety shortcomings on campus. $40,000 went to the Res Club. The money was used to install sprinklers, 2 enclosed fire escapes, and an alarm system prior to the building reopening for the fall term. The university was not fined for the fire code violations brought to light by the fire. Survivors of the fire faulted the university not just for the circumstances that existed in the building prior to the fire, but also for their response to the fire, and the lack of support they showed to the surviving students and the families of those who had been lost. Some of the survivors were able to get 1 session with university-affiliated mental health professionals, but found them underqualified to help them cope with the trauma of the fire. It's clear the university behaved unbelievably badly and acted irresponsibly toward us, FUD Joshua Freeman told the New York Times in 2018. We felt we were on our own, getting support from each other and friends and the community, and nothing whatsoever from Cornell. I can absolutely say they did nothing. Joshua's father had arrived at Cornell 3 days after the fire and ran into the parents of Jeffrey Smith, one of the FUDs who had died in the fire. They told him that Cornell had so far not even spoken to them about the loss of their son. The investigation into the Res Club fire did little to comfort its survivors, and in many cases only made things worse for them. Surviving residents were questioned about the fire, and many felt as though they were all being considered as suspects. The tactics used by authorities during questioning were often an additional source of stress. For example, police seemed to suspect that Diego Bernardetti, who had been awake working on a paper when the fire started spreading, and therefore was one of the first residents to alert others about the danger, may have set the fire so he could then play the hero. While he was being questioned, authorities told him that they knew he had set the fire, so he may as well just confess. They also asked him to take a polygraph examination, but left him with the impression he did not really have an option in the matter. He was not the only resident who underwent such aggressive questioning, or a polygraph examination, during the initial investigation. Rumors about who started the fire quickly began circulating around campus, often to the great detriment of the individuals accused by them. Potential suspects were suggested for a variety of alleged circumstances. The cook's son was allegedly mentally unsound, a night manager who had recently been fired was reportedly witnessed at the scene, a counselor had been informed they would not be retained by the university in their position the week before the fire because he allegedly kept a can of gasoline in his kitchen. They were also concerned that the fire may have been an attack on the new accelerated PhD program, since the FUDs were housed at the Res Club and made up the majority of its residents. Perhaps someone was upset about the dorm being co-ed or bothered by the seemingly elite nature of the program. One student had already dropped out of the rigorous program, having earned all Fs in their classes, save for one D-. The possibility that he may have set the fire out of bitterness towards the program made its way through the rumor mill. Another student, who had been warned that he may be removed from the program due to his poor performance, reportedly was excited about the fire and the media attention it garnered. He was investigated by the police and underwent 4 polygraph examinations, all of which came back inconclusive. On May 22nd, the Cornell Daily Sun published an article based on statements from an anonymous source claiming that there had been a death club made up of FUDs. The group allegedly met to talk about death-related topics, and how to get as close to death as possible without actually dying. Reportedly, they played macabre music, and its members had trouble making friends with other members of the program. The article focused on one female FUD in particular, alleging that she had cut her own wrists following one of these meetings just before Christmas, and stating that she had been discussing the first chapter of the Book of Ezekiel during one of these supposed death sessions just before the Res Club fire. The first 13 verses of this book of the Bible occur on the 5th day of the 4th month and detail a fiery vision from God. The Res Club fire occurred on the 5th day of the 4th month. The problem with these rumors was that such a death club did not exist. A lot of people were talking through their hat to newspaper reporters and feeling important, FUD Lauren Cobb would later tell the New York Times. The rumor and misinformation about that program was phenomenal. The idea of quoting the Bible was not unusual. We quoted Chaucer, we quoted Beowulf, we quoted Gilgamesh. While a female student was not named in the article, she was easily identifiable because of the mention of the incident in which she cut her wrists around Christmas. A female FUD had cut her wrists the previous December, but it was after an argument with her parents, not after a so-called death session. She also had discussed the Book of Ezekiel with another student in early April, but it was while discussing a potential idea for a paper for a class. This student, unsurprisingly, did not handle the extreme scrutiny she was under as a result of the article well. She had been considered a potential suspect prior to the article being published, because other students had reported her lack of satisfaction with the accelerated PhD program and claimed she had been lighting and blowing out matches with another student prior to the fire. The article only increased the pressure she was under. The director of the accelerated PhD program allegedly called her parents to tell them their daughter was a murderer. By the beginning of June, investigators realized that there was nothing to the reports of a death club, and their investigation into it had done nothing to move the case forward. Damage had already been done by it, however, and the student at the center of the inquiry left Cornell, never to obtain a college degree. She initially supported herself by working at a pizza parlor, but ultimately found success working in the insurance industry. The members of the accelerated PhD program specifically would not have long to process their trauma from the Res Club fire before events created even more stress around the incident. There was no building available to continue housing all the FUDs together, as they were used to, so they were spread throughout various locations. However, smaller groups of FUDs did remain together in their new temporary accommodations. 3 FUDs were housed at the Water Margin Collective residence, and on May 23rd, a fire broke out there. No one was injured during the fire, but it was immediately considered suspicious, as it had 3 separate points of origin in the residence's living room. 8 days later, another fire was set in the entranceway of a rooming house on Eddy Street in Ithaca, where 7 FUDs had been living. Again, no one was harmed. However, the fatal fire in April and the 2 subsequent fires at the end of May had all occurred at locations where FUDs had been living, and had all started between 4 and 5 a.m. In light of these connections, the Ithaca fire chief stated that there was too much coincidence for me to accept. The coincidences were also too much for many of the already traumatized FUDs to handle. The 2 subsequent fires seemed to confirm fears some of them had held since the fire at the Res Club, that an arsonist was targeting members of their program specifically. Many members of the program began taking extreme actions in order to ensure they would not fall victim to another fire, which seemed almost inevitable for a time. One FUD kept a long rope in his room in case he needed to escape another fire through his window, and altered his schedule so that he could sleep during the day and do his schoolwork during the night, allowing him to be awake when the arsonist liked to strike. Some of the FUDs who lived together began sleeping in shifts so that someone was always awake to alert them to any danger. All I know is that he is out there and he wants to kill me. I don't know his name and he doesn't know me. Marvin L. Marshak, who was not a FUD but lived in a house with 6 of them, wrote in a column for the Cornell Daily Sun in June. The fears that an arsonist was targeting members of the accelerated PhD program were seemingly confirmed 4 months after the Res Club fire. At the coroner's inquest held 2 weeks after the fire, Tompkins County Coroner Dr. Ralph J. Lowe had found that while a human factor appeared to be involved in the fire, rather than some sort of mechanical failure, it could not be identified without further investigation, leaving open the possibilities of the fire being either arson or an accident. The evidence presented at this inquest is such as to minimize the possibility of mechanical accident and makes the fire more probably the result of human carelessness or malice. I conclude at this time that the fire is of undetermined origin. I recommend that the investigation be continued by the District Attorney's Office, he said in his statement. However, in August of 1967, Ithaca Police Chief Herbert Van Ostrand announced that a Canadian chemist had found traces of a liquid accelerant at the scenes of all 3 of the fires that occurred at locations where FUDs were being housed, including the Res Club. The evidence of traces of accelerant being found at the Res Club specifically is not as strong as Chief Van Ostrand's statement suggests, however, and has led to ongoing controversy over the nature of that fire specifically. Chief Van Ostrand would not say what the accelerant was, as this evidence convinced him that all 3 fires were therefore arson, and he did not want to jeopardize any further potential prosecution in the case. However, further evidence to support an arrest was never found, and no one was ever charged with the arsons. While Cornell was not fined for the fire code violations that contributed to the loss of life during the Res Club fire, it did face financial repercussions. On March 14, 1968, the parents of Jeffrey Smith Jr., the youngest victim of the fire, filed a $1.75 million lawsuit against Cornell, alleging negligence. The case did not go to court until December of 1972. By this time, just Jeffrey's father was suing the school. His mother, Margaret, had died after overdosing on barbiturates in 1969. The psychiatrist who had treated both Jeffrey Sr. and Margaret, Dr. Hack, was called as a witness during the court proceedings. He had started treating both of them 3 weeks after the fire, and diagnosed both of them with severe neurotic depression. He found the proximate cause of their depression to be the death of their son. Dr. Hack saw Margaret Smith approximately 70 times between April of 1967 and her death in October of 1969. He treated her with antidepressants and a short course of electroshock therapy, but found her to be almost completely incapacitated for the majority of the time she was under his care, despite her treatments. Jeffrey Smith Sr. had been an accountant, but his grief at his son's death and the severe depression it led to left him unable to work. His condition did not improve in the 5.5 years between his son's death and his lawsuit coming to court, despite treatment. Dr. Hack testified that his energy is markedly reduced. He is without goals, beyond merely sustaining himself from day to day. His appearance is often relatively unkempt. He requires motivation to make him, and to diminish any sort of emotion, which might also produce a self-destructive suicide. The suit was settled before it was sent to a jury, and the United States Northern District Court of New York found Cornell to have been negligent. Jeffrey Smith Sr. was awarded $150,000, equivalent to nearly $1 million in 2021. Cornell's accelerated PhD program enrolled a total of 4 classes of FUDs, and was shut down after those students completed their studies. Many of the program's students did end up completing a PhD, but not all of them did so at Cornell, and most did not do it within 6 years. The Res Club fire would continue to impact its survivors for years to come, with many of them requiring psychotherapy, and at least one of them developing a substance abuse problem in response to the tragedy. Many students were plagued by survivor's guilt, or by nightmares and flashbacks about the fire. The focus on the FUDs as the potential targets of the fires led to the surviving residents of the second floor, who were not a part of the program, to feel ignored. "We were sort of considered collateral damage. We were extras," Sherry Carr, a Cornell senior who lived on the second floor, said in 2018. Ms. Carr, a retired lawyer, still has the key to her room at the Res Club, and still wakes up in a cold sweat at 4 a.m. every April 5th. While the effects of the fire carried throughout the lives of its survivors, no new evidence about the fire has been unearthed since 1967. In 2013, Bill Fogel, a Cornell alumnus who had been unaffiliated with the accelerated PhD program and did not live at the Res Club, began researching the fire after coming across newspaper articles about it while working with the records from his fraternity chapter to write its history. He then began an extensive effort, locating records and contacting survivors of the fire, as well as members of law enforcement connected to the case. He eventually identified someone he considered to be a very strong suspect in the arsons, a FUD who left Cornell and later changed his name. In February of 2017, with the 50th anniversary of the fire approaching, Mr. Fogel wrote a letter to the editor, published in the Cornell Daily Sun. He wrote a second letter in May of 2018. In these letters, he criticizes Cornell's response to what he argues are definitively 9 homicides, as well as the paper's reporting on the fire. In response to Mr. Fogel, Harlan McEwen, who had been the principal Cayuga Heights police investigator assigned to the Res Club fire and had worked on the case exclusively for over a year, wrote his own letters to the editor in April of 2017 and May of 2018. Following his time as an investigator, Mr. McEwen had gone on to be chief of police in Cayuga Heights, the chief of police in Ithaca, and then an FBI deputy assistant director prior to his retirement. He considered the Res Club fire to be one of the most tragic events he investigated during his long career. In his letters, he denied allegations made by Mr. Fogel that Cornell had interfered in his investigation, that the Cornell Daily Sun had failed in its coverage of the fire, and the claim that the 9 victims of the fire had without a doubt been murdered. Recent allegations by Cornell graduate William Fogel Jr. that the Cornell Residential Club fire was an arson and the deaths should be declared murders is not supported by the facts as currently known. The facts, as I personally know them, are that 9 people tragically perished from asphyxia due to toxic smoke inhalation. The ruling of the former coroner in April 1967 that the fire was more probably the result of human carelessness or malice is as accurate today as it was then, he wrote. Speaking with the New York Times in 2018, Mr. McEwen explained why Mr. Fogel's use of a certain piece of information in his argument that the Res Club fire was definitely an arson is misleading. The argument that the Res Club fire was an arson depends heavily on the findings of Philip Braid, a chemist in Ontario. He wrote to the police in New York saying that he had found traces of an accelerant in a piece of rug padding taken from the Res Club. This led to Ithaca Police Chief Herbert Van Ostrand announcing that all 3 fires set where FUDs were being housed, including the fatal fire at the Res Club, were the result of arson. However, the state police lab had not found any traces of accelerant during their testing of samples from the Res Club. After Philip Braid reported his results, they retested their samples and again found no accelerant. The samples that had been sent to Ontario had been collected by an engineer retained by the insurer of the Res Club building. Mr. McEwen witnessed the engineer, whom he described as a nut, collect these samples. He says the engineer collected the samples improperly and allowed different samples to commingle together. The non-fatal fires almost certainly were arson, as supported by the accelerant evidence found at those scenes. However, with the accelerant evidence from the Res Club called into question, there is a lack of definitive proof that the Res Club fire had been intentionally set. Mechanical factors were ruled out as potential causes of the fire early on, leaving the possibility of the Res Club fire being the result of arson open. However, the possibility that the fire had been accidentally set also remains open, without the results of the accelerant testing at the Res Club being definitive. While no new evidence about the Res Club fire has been discovered since 1967, the investigation remains open. Tompkins County District Attorney Matt Van Houten looked at the case file after he took office in 2017 and said in an interview that same year that he had not been the first DA to do so in the previous 50 years. We do know that the fire was of human origin. In other words, it was not a mechanical fire. There was nothing structural that caused the fire. It was caused by human negligence or intentional human conduct, he said in the same interview. Based on the initial investigation, which DA Van Houten believes was sound, 4 persons of interest in the case have been identified. However, according to DA Van Houten, there is no evidence that would raise them from a person of interest to a suspect. 3 of the persons of interest are male, and 1 is female. They had all been members of the accelerated PhD program. One of the persons of interest stood out over the others. Reportedly, the same individual, Bill Fogel, has identified as a strong suspect. None of these persons of interest have ever been identified publicly, in case evidence ever allows prosecutors to file charges against someone, but District Attorney Van Houten has also said that this will most likely not occur without a confession or a new witness coming forward. Cornell's class of 1967 installed a small plaque at the Res Club listing the names of the victims of the fire, but it was not in a highly visible location and not placed there by Cornell. Those who knew the victims believed they deserved a more prominent memorial, and one from the university itself. Survivors of the Res Club fire did not believe Cornell itself had properly acknowledged and commemorated the fire, their experiences, and the 9 lives that had been cut short. In August of 2018, a group of 13 survivors, along with 3 relatives of students killed in the fire, met with Cornell President Martha Pollack with specific requests to correct the failures of previous administrations. The group asked for a public apology on behalf of Cornell for its actions both before and after the fire, for the fire code violations and lack of required safety features in the Res Club, which contributed to the loss of life, and what they would later describe as a shocking lack of support offered by the university to the fire survivors, their families, and the families of the dead after the fire. They also asked for all available files about the fire and the subsequent investigation to be made available to them in full. It was also important that the victims of the fire be more fully and appropriately memorialized. They hoped for both a physical memorial on campus as well as living memorials in the form of 9 annual scholarships, each named for a victim of the fire and awarded to a student who was in their same field of study. During the meeting, President Pollock suggested an annual lecture series with a lecture named after each victim as another possibility for a living memorial. A physical memorial to the victims of the fire would finally arrive on the Cornell campus in 2019. On October 4th, a memorial was dedicated to the victims of the fire. The memorial consists of 9 boulders of local limestone, 1 for each victim, and a large bronze plaque. River birch was planted around it, creating what was described during the ceremony as an oasis for peaceful remembrance, where the memory of these 9 Cornellians will endure. The memorial stands between Day Hall and Sage Memorial Chapel, where the memorial service for those lost in the fire had been held more than 52 years earlier. For too long, all of you have felt unheard and your memories unacknowledged, Cornell President Martha Pollock said in a speech at the dedication, addressing the survivors of the fire and the loved ones of the victims. No one can take away the pain of what you experienced, but what we can do is hear your stories and become the custodians of your memories with this memorial, which will remain here in the heart of campus as long as the university stands. There may never be enough evidence to show if the Res Club fire was a deliberate arson or a tragic accident. Even if it is proven to be the result of arson, the perpetrator may never be brought to justice or even definitively identified. While the mystery and controversy may forever endure at Cornell, more importantly, so will the memories of the 9 people lost in the fire. While the mystery and controversy may forever endure at Cornell, more importantly, so will the memories of the 9 people lost in the fire.